What do you think is the main purpose of Donald Trump's visit to China?
Well, I think as we've watched the way he's interacted with each country on this trip, it becomes more and more apparent, and maybe Victor Gao will also agree with me here, that his priority is a solution to the Korean nuclear crisis. If he can get a trade deal on the way, he's certainly going to try. He's a man who tries to get deals, but he's really coming to China after having made very strong words in front of the ROK National Assembly with respect to China's role in a solution to put pressure on China. And I think we can expect that that's foremost on his mind.
Put pressure on China. How do you think China will react to that?
No, I think China will do the right thing, and China will not yield to any pressure applied to China by any other country, including the United States.
What's China's main standing and main stance on this?
On the Korean situation,
Right.
of course, China stands firmly for denuclearization, and that's the right thing for China and many other countries to do. And it requires cooperation, especially between China and the United States. And any kind of a threat to use military means to solve the problem will not work. And hopefully the Chinese president and the US president can really have time to sit down to talk about what's the better way to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula.
But Professor, would you agree that part of the argument the U.S. is now making is not just that it's in the U.S. interest, but that it's in the world's interest and it's in China's interest to denuclearize the peninsula, to reach an agreement?
Absolutely.
So they're
you are
trying to
right.
make the argument on China's terms in some ways, in an appealing way to Beijing, I think, because it's really, I've seen over the last 6 or 7 years of covering it, I know you've followed it for much longer than I, a change in the way the White House is even talking about the problem.
In what way?
Well, in the fact that it's a global problem, that it's not just
It's
the
not a problem between the U.S.
Right.
and DPRK.
Right, and we're even hearing China talk more about this as a global problem as opposed to something between the U.S. and DPRK, and that's not something I was hearing from Chinese diplomats a couple of years ago.
Well, let's go back to the Capital International Airport, where the Air Force One has already touched down, and the Donald Trump and his wife and the delegation with him are going to step out of the plane. And they are going to be welcomed by a special ceremony held by China. And the makeup of the delegation joining Trump in Asia varies from country to country. And this time, some high-ranking officials, business chiefs, and also Trump's family members are expected to accompany Trump on his visit to China. The high-ranking officials include Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, and Senior Policy Advisor Stephen Miller, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, of course, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Business chiefs from Goldman Sachs and Boeing, agriculture and energy firms are likely to be on Trump's plane. Trump's wife, Melania Trump, and also son-in-law Jared Kushner are also on the plane. And talking about the makeup of the delegation, Jessica, how do you make of the people that Donald Trump is bringing with him? What can we read from the composition of the delegation?
I've actually written something about this because I think it's been interesting as I've tried to prepare myself for the trip to watch the people not going as we got closer because of domestic issues that they were asked to take care of. Ivanka was supposed to be here. Mr. Cohen, his National Economic Council advisor, and of course Secretary Mnuchin was supposed to be on this trip. So what that tells me is that he's putting all of the trade eggs in the basket of Robert Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross, and that could be a much more transactional approach. In other words, not working on structural reforms between the two countries on the trade level, but working on commerce deals to announce, and some of those are already being leaked in the media.
Well, Mr. Gao, China will continue its opening up policy according to the 19th Party Congress just concluded, and China will not only continue its opening up, it will start all dimension opening up to the world. And do you think, according to makeup of the delegation, do you think Donald Trump's intention of opening up to China will fit into China's policy to open up?
Well,
to the world?
definitely. I think China-U.S. relations are the most important bilateral relations in the world today. And China has all the reasons to improve the relations between China and the United States. And the better relations, more constructive relations between our two countries will be very good for world peace and stability. And I think how to further improve the bilateral relations, how to overcome all the obstacles over there. And it is a key challenge, and the two countries actually see the same issue from very different perspectives. And President Donald Trump also has made different remarks about how he wants to deal with the China-US relations, how to deal with the trade imbalance, for example, how the two countries can cooperate to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. So we need to really very carefully listen to what President Donald Trump has to say, but also continue to do the right thing. Better relations between China and the United States is a must. And it is not only good for China and the United States, it's good for mankind as a whole.
Well, as what Donald Trump said, 1,000 reasons to have good relations with China, not even a single reason to damage it, indeed. Well, still on the makeup of the delegation, some are apparently selling products like Airbus, and some on environmental cooperation with China, apparently, and some are on finance and insurance even. Well, Mr. Gao, are these areas that China needs the investment the most?
No, I think all these companies are very important companies. I learned that there were more than 100 companies which joined in the bid in try to be selected to come here. And these companies, which were eventually selected to join President Donald Trump's important state visit to China, have very long-standing relations with China. Many have been very successful in dealing with China. Boeing, for example, is very, very important to the Chinese civil aviation industry, and China is probably the second largest, if not already very soon, the largest market for Boeing. And going forward, I think the China market means the life or death of Boeing going forward for many decades to come. And I think further cooperation between Boeing and the Chinese aviation industry is both good for China, but also very, very crucially important for Boeing itself. And we want to improve these very close cooperations with Boeing, with Goldman Sachs, with all the other companies. For example, GE is very successful and long-standing relations in the China market. We view GE probably more as a Chinese company than an American company, and we wish all these companies huge success in the China market.
Right.
And I would just add, if I could just add, before this visit, there was an announcement that really indicated an open door to China selling airplane parts and eventually airplanes to the United States. This was a regulatory decision that was announced ahead of time. So you can see the welcome that the U.S. has towards doing more in that area of the market.
But Donald Trump is not aiming to sell several planes only, right? So what is
I don't think he'll stop there,
strategy? He will not stop there. So what will be his long-term strategy in terms of trade?
Obviously, the trade deficit is the major bee in his bonnet. He repeats it almost every time he talks about China. But you know, it depends on how you measure it. We've talked a lot about on this broadcast the way that you measure it. There's a services deficit on the Chinese side, for example, and I think China makes a very valid point, which is that China has become an assembly location for many of these products, and yet they're counted as part of the deficit, and the actual parts are made in other parts of the world. That their numbers, essentially, their trading relationship is not as affected by these numbers. So. You know, he's got, and there are many economists that talk about how this is not a good way to measure the trade relationship. So he's got to move beyond this number to talk about the relationship and make it more comprehensive.
But and China, concerning China, there is not very clear China policy from the Trump administration just yet. Why is that? Why is it so difficult?
I think there's a lot of voices, and I think National Security Advisor McMaster talked about the disparate voices that are still within the administration. You've got China hawks, you've got China doves, as it were. You've got people who are very used to working and living and making business deals in China. And then you've got people who have real ideology.
All right, we have to come back to the Capital International Airport of Beijing, where Donald Trump and his wife Melania are stepping out of the plane right now. And this is President Trump's first visit to China as the President of the United States. And the ceremony is going to be held by the Chinese side to welcome him. And before his trip to China, he has already visited the two allies of the US in Asia, Japan and South Korea. What we see now from picture is US President Donald Trump and his wife are being welcomed at the Beijing Capital International Airport. But China's relationship with the US has developed since Trump entered the White House. And since Trump's election, the leaders of the two countries have spoken on the phone 8 times, including a conversation in March in which Trump agreed to honor the One China policy. And during a visit to the US in April, Chinese President Xi Jinping said there was a wealth of reasons for the nations to have a good relationship. And US President Donald Trump's first visit to China is actually a historic opportunity to boost cooperation between the world's two largest economies, and also a chance to tackle the problems that has dampened or made bilateral ties ups and downs. It comes at a time when the two nations' relationship is solid and stable, despite, as what we said just now, unpredictable China policies and some possible conflicts on the trade and economic front. The future of the relationship is believed to be bright and stable. Bilateral ties are crucial for their development, of course. But Trump's visit to China this time are believed to be mainly focusing on security issues and energy cooperation, as well as seeking approaches to reduce friction on the trade imbalance and intellectual property rights. And Chinese President Xi Jinping and Trump will also exchange in-depth views on China-US relations, as well as major global and regional issues of common concern. You're now watching our special coverage on Donald Trump, US President's visit to China, and this is his first visit as the President of the United States to China. And we have in the studio have been talking about the relations between China and the US. Victor Gauchikayo, current affairs commentator, and also our White House correspondent Jessica Stone. Well, Jessica, trade, of course, apart from the DPRK issue, trade tops agenda of Donald Trump's visit and meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, of course. Trade has not always been smooth between the two countries. There are a lot of frictions. So what are the major frictions happened after Donald Trump took office?
Well, he's had this strategy of getting a bunch of investigations going, of threatening tariffs, and and so far he's held off on executing most of those. There's areas in IP. We've seen a lot of cases be brought in front of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States in the solar arena, aluminum and steel. And there's some thinking and some reporting in the American press that those may be executed after this visit to provide more of the pressure we were talking about earlier with respect to the DPRK. But those are areas that have been long-standing tensions in some cases. I do think that having covered the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, we do see more cases being brought